What happens when a new hire's cultural expectations do not match up with an organization's culture? What can we do to minimize that culture shock?
This podcast is brought to you by ArchMed, fast and focused design and manufacturing.
I'm Greg Maurer, founder and owner of ArchMed.
And I'm Caroline Squatrigo, talent engagement specialist. We are on a journey to grow, learn, and gain expertise in small to mid-size company culture. Join us.
All right, Caroline, what's the question of the day?
So today we'll be talking about culture shock. First of all, what is it? And also how can we prevent it or do the best that we can to prevent it? So first we'll actually be joined by ArchMed's Nathan Jones. Nathan is our capacity planning manager, and he has experienced firsthand the consequences of bringing in a new hire who's unable to really adapt to a new company culture. Then later we're going to speak with Randy Brown. He was the chief HR officer at WellPoint for over 12 years. And he'll be kind of talking to us about how can we do our best to prevent these types of things from happening, and how can we properly transition people into a new culture.
All right, Nathan. Well, hey, first of all, thanks a lot for coming in and joining us and talking about your take or your perspective on when we brought in a VP of Ops who came from a really different company culture than ours, and there was a bit of culture shock. So love to hear your perspective on that.
Absolutely. Yes, I did have an opportunity to learn from this experience with this individual that came in. So I kind of have an understanding of what culture shock is in the way of, like traveling. A lot of times people will be traveling through different countries and they go through culture shock, and that directly relates and translates into the business world. But it also directly translates into something I'm more familiar with, or have been, is a fish tank. So, I don't know. Growing up, I grew up with a lot of fish, raising fish. Not really, you don't raise fish, but you have fish, and they're in fish tanks. Growing up, we had a variety of fish. And one thing that you learn is that you don't just throw a fish in the tank. You have to go through the process to ensure that it's not shocked. So that process I've noticed related, and I saw those same reactions out of this individual when they came through. And one of them, I guess, the processes that I've noticed, and I looked some of these things up for the culture shock, and there's 4 stages for culture shock, and they are all relevant to the business setting as well as the fish tank, strangely. So, and those 4 stages are the honeymoon stage, frustration stage, adaptation stage, and acceptance stage. So, I guess to get started with that honeymoon stage, that basically is just a new environment for that person. There's excitement, there's high energy, but that stage is short-lived.
Yeah, it felt very short in the scenario we're talking about. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, we experienced that with this individual. This person jumped in head first, didn't assess the environment. It was quickly overwhelmed. And like I said, relating that to the fish tank, you have the tank, you have the fish coming into the new tank. It's bagged and segregated, and that's where it should be. It should be separated so we can get used to the environment. And that's not what happened. He just kind of jumped in and became overwhelmed very quickly. So there's one thing that I've noticed as well, is that culture shock doesn't just affect the person that's coming in. It affects the entire organization. So that step, with that in-your-face excitement, it created a lot of anxiety for the organization and also a lot of caution.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we're a tight-knit group, and so it's really easy for us to, I guess, not trust someone when we feel like they're coming in a little hot without trying to understand us. And I mean, I remember I was only an intern back there, but I felt it just being around this individual and picking up on the energy that he brought out in people. I think people just didn't know what to do with him, being that he was new and didn't really introduce himself very well, I would say, and just started commanding, which we're a more collaborative group than that. I don't know, Nathan, how you felt being in the presence of that differing leadership style.
Yeah, it was definitely overwhelming for me. Like I said, that in-your-face scenario where he just came out like a bull in the china shop, just raring and ready to go and not following steps to acclimate. So, which brings us to the frustration stage for him, which is, in general, identifying and observing the foreign processes, procedures, traditions, and terminology. The language barrier that you have within a new organization, personalities, nuances of each individual that you work with, all those types of things that have to be noticed. But when you notice these changes, you get frustrated with how the new is versus what the old was. So you notice these differences. I feel like that frustration really motivated his actions. Absolutely. Yeah, he continued to be frustrated because he was getting pushed back. We were giving pushback. It was just a constant battle back and forth.
And I think as a leader, I'm going to take some responsibility for this because, we just threw him in the fish tank, to use your analogy, Nathan, and I didn't acknowledge that he came from a culture where there was a lot of bureaucratic layers and silos, and he had all the credentials, but he didn't know how to roll his sleeves up, interact with others without regard to organizational hierarchy, and walk the floor.
I agree. And I don't think we've ever had an opportunity to practice that process before. That was new to us. We've never had anyone quite that excessive in having that culture shock. So.
Yeah, Nathan, what change did you see when we did part ways with this individual? I mean, we had a lot of that pent-up frustration during his time here, but what happened when he did leave?
Well, like I was saying, the culture shock for the individual is one thing, but for the organization, it takes a toll. There's a lot of anxiety. We even have people that have just given up on certain things because they feel like they've been backed into a corner. They're frustrated as well. There's no trust in that position. So when that person leaves, it's just relief. Like, okay, we can get back to the normal.
Like
we
an
can
exhale.
start.
Like we've all been holding our breath, and we can finally exhale. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Do you think it took work to get us back to like our normal rhythm and culture when this person left, or did it kind of snap back?
I think it snapped back pretty quickly.
Okay.
Yeah, the damage was short-lived, and I think it's because the process of him going through all this shock was identified somewhat, so everyone was taken with a grain of salt. Like, okay, this will be short-lived. He can't last much longer. It's just not feasible for him to continue to be able to do this and not either see what's happening and correct it himself, or he just runs out of steam and he gives up. We somewhat expected him to be able to bring something new to the table. So we expected some sort of process change that he could have brought to help the organization. It was just the timing behind it. He didn't learn our processes. He didn't assimilate. He tried to be the assimilator instead of be assimilated too quickly. So he didn't find out how we did things. He didn't even really understand what it was that we fully did. So he was pressing and pushing his changes, and directing the group towards change and altering the routine before he even learned what the routine was. So he couldn't find out where those missing gaps were.
Well, we have Randy Brown with us here today. You may remember Randy from episode number 2 of this podcast. Randy was the chief HR officer at WellPoint for over 12 years. He currently is an executive career mentor and MBA leadership coach at Butler University's Lacey School of Business. Welcome, Randy.
Great to be with you, Greg.
Yeah, great to be with you as well. And we really appreciate you coming back on. So today we're talking about culture shock. And we told a story about how we hired on somebody who experienced some culture shock, and it ended up not working out, in part because of that kind of culture shock. And we're trying to figure out how to deal with that. And all cultures are unique. We've definitely learned that each culture is unique. So it seems to me that no matter where you go, you're going to be entering a culture that is at least somewhat, if not drastically different than the one you just left. And so isn't there always a bit of culture shock when you join a new company?
It's a great question. I think there's always a bit of learning, no matter how much both parties do their due diligence. There's something new that you get surprised by after you join a company, or the company gets surprised by after they hire you. But I do think that more than most people think, you can minimize that by doing some homework, by doing some due diligence on the company you might join or the person you might want to hire, so that it's learning and not shock.
So how do you do that? How do you do the diligence on the culture from where they're coming?
So if you're the hiring entity, right, as a hiring entity, how do you check out somebody for a cultural fit?
Well, how do you figure out whether the level of cultural shock you might encounter? And they could still be a cultural fit and yet have culture shock.
I think maybe it's as simple as talking about the process of interviewing and how you probe and what you look for. So, for example, we all know we interview for skills, right? We try and find out what the person has accomplished, what they've done, what their skill set is. But you can often ask them questions that give you a clue about hiring. What kind of place do you want to work for? When you've done well in the past, what kind of environment has that been in? Well, how do you make decisions? How do you get things done? You can ask the behavioral questions that give you a clue as to not just does this person have skills and do they get results, but how do they do it? And when you assess that, you're better able to lower the likelihood of organ rejection or bad cultural fit.
So Greg and I came up with this question because we have experienced it in the past. I don't want to call our culture a loud one, but it can be kind of jarring because we want people to work how they best work effectively. We don't want to tell people how to work. And sometimes that can turn into not giving someone the level of support that they're accustomed to, or the level of here's exactly how you do it, because we don't like to tell people exactly how to do things. We want to see how they do it. How do you manage that? I mean, we want someone to come in and be able to think for themselves. And often people almost feel like scared to do that. I'm always asking people, how do you think we should do it? And it's like, do you really want to know? And I'm like, yes, I want to know. I want you to tell me because we hired you. How do you manage through that type of a process and kind of jumpstart the cultural learning?
Well, one of the things I always suggest to people who are candidates is that they check out the culture of the place they're about to join as much as the company checks them out. How do you make decisions around there? What kind of person does well there? And hopefully, if the person has done their due diligence, they'll also be able to minimize the culture shock for them. But one of the things that I think companies don't do enough of is they don't talk enough about what their culture is. It's one thing to say, by the way, we tend to be a bit rock and roll around here. We have fun, we do hard work, but we do it in a fun way. How do you feel about that? Not make people have to feel it out, not guess. You do have to leave room for diversity of approach and style, and diversity in all its forms. You don't want everybody to be exactly alike. That is not a good competitive way to run a business. But you can certainly talk about the norms and how things tend to work and what type of things are expected and not. And I think if you talk about it more, people are less likely to be surprised, and they waste a lot less time trying to figure it out and trying to guess.
So I really like what you said there, Randy, about talking about the culture in an intentional and specific way in the recruiting process, because I think the more you talk about something, the less of a shock it'll be once you experience it firsthand and in an immersion environment. And I think we could do a much better job of that. We talk in generalities about our culture, but not in specifics. And we did toy with this idea of making funny, tongue-in-cheek, maybe even self-deprecating videos about our culture. And I'm not quite sure whether that's an ideal way to get the word out, because it's a little bit flippant and not too serious. But then again, maybe it does work. What do you think about sort of the tongue-in-cheek videos?
I think doing that would say something about the culture you're about to join. So in other words, if you think those videos are a reflection of what you get if you join Archimed, then do it. Then you'll attract people who are going to enjoy that, and you'll probably make people who wouldn't enjoy that think twice, right? Lessening the likelihood of a bad cultural fit either way. So you do have to sometimes be careful that people won't get your humor. But if that's part of who you are and humor is part of your culture, advertising it. But I think your point, Greg, to be specific about what you mean when you say, here's our culture, it's, we're playful. We like to have fun and we get things done. It's being more specific about what you believe a good culture looks like. And that way, when you are more specific with examples even, then people can see whether it's a match, and you can see whether it's a match for them too.
So we spend a lot of time on that aspect of culture, the playfulness and the camaraderie and the familial atmosphere and things like that. But there are other operational aspects of our culture, one of which was part of the story we told at the beginning of this podcast, which is what I'll call simply walk the floor. And we don't have managers that spend all day in an office not interacting, just firing out emails and running the factory from a piece of paper. You have to get up and walk the floor, and there's dozens and dozens of aspects of our culture like that I don't think we could possibly cover them all. What is there a technique to figure out cultural fit from an operational perspective? This sort of walk the floor aspect is an example.
Yes, I think in order to make sure you have good cultural fit both ways, it is good for a company to kind of reflect and say, what are the most important aspects of our culture that we want people to know? Is it how we engage? Is it how we make decisions? Is it the speed with which we operate? Is it the quality that we try and exhibit? Is it how we work together? And you're right, you can't highlight everything, but what are the most important things? And if you can do that, your example is we walk the floor, we engage with each other directly. If you like engagement, regular engagement between bosses and the people who do the work, then you'll like it here. If that's an important part of how you work and you want to highlight that, then by all means do it. But I think sometimes people make the mistake of talking about culture as ping pong tables and breakout rooms and things like that. And yeah, that's really not the culture that matters as much as how you engage, how you make decisions, how you get results. I think if people understand how you function in the business, then they're more likely to know whether it's a fit for them.
So we have a value statement, we have a mission statement. Maybe we ought to have a statement of our cultural tenets, and get that out and publicized and openly discussed.
I think it's a great idea. And I think I might have shared in my prior life, we did a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and usually the thing that would get in our way is not paying enough attention to culture. And again, I don't mean ping pong tables. I mean how the two entities did things, how they made decisions, and how and when we didn't talk about those things, we just sort of, without any bad intent, we screwed things up. And so the more likelihood of, like anything you do, the more intentional, the more clear you are about it, and the more you talk about it, the less likely it is to be a miss for you in your hiring and in the engagement of your employees. A quick case in point, companies can be very collaborative in their decision making, and they like to strive for consensus. Some companies, they want to go fast and they don't want to take the time to collaborate. And neither one is necessarily right or wrong. But if you're a collaborator and you hire into a company that goes fast and you want to take your time to collaborate and they think you're taking your time and you're not decisive, it's a disconnect, right? So even something as simple as decision-making speed and styles and how you do it, to be clear on what your preferred style is an important thing to do. And the more specific you can be, the more you can attract the right kind of person.
So I'm thinking about like when we've had failures in the past, and from my perspective, anytime we've had a manager come in and just completely like fall on their face is when exactly like Greg was saying, there's someone who's like accustomed, and not really to a fault of their own, but to sitting in their office and kind of handing down orders. And this happens way more with like a manager individual or someone who has like all this great managerial experience. Do you think that there is like a natural correlation between like kind of rising the org chart ranks and like that lack of connection to people like throughout the entire organization? Because that's what we see all the time, and maybe we're not recruiting correctly, which we might have to look at. But that's when we have issues with managers. That's often where it comes from. It is that like disconnect, or that like I'm better than this person, or like I'm just here to tell you what to do. I'm not actually going to be doing things.
Right. It sounds like what I'm hearing is a really important part of your culture is that nobody, no matter how high they are in leadership, gets to be disconnected from the front lines. And if that's the case, saying that, talking to people about that, asking them, what their preferred style is, the larger their organizations grew, how did they adapt, screening for that when you talk to them, showing them how you make a decision. All those things are things you can screen for. And, it's possible that maybe when you did I had mistakes all the time. When you had a hiring mistake, it was that you just didn't screen enough for that. Maybe too focused on skills and abilities and accomplishments as opposed to approach.
Yeah. And I mean, to that end, when you're bringing in someone, whether it's like a C-suite person in general or like a CEO, they're probably going to have a big wave impact on culture. And ideally, you're bringing this person in because you're looking forward to that impact. But how do you kind of manage the two? I don't want to say contradicting cultures, but they're probably going to have a little bit of a different idea. And if you're coming into this organization with a culture, how do you kind of manage those two conflicting agendas?
Such a great question. So here's what I would say is whatever CEO, let's just go with CEO, whatever CEO you hire is going to shape the culture, period, full stop. They will. Organizations tend to take on the shadow of their leader. They tend to mimic how their leader behaves. They look up for guidance and they follow cues. And even when leaders don't think they're giving cues, they are. They're giving cues. They're sending signals about how I like to decide, how I like to get data, how I like to communicate all the time. And their actions speak far louder than their words. So if you have a culture that you really like and you think it's helping you get results, then you probably better hire a CEO who's going to further that and be in sync with that culture. If you think your culture is not where you want it to be, then hire a CEO who's going to act differently and role model different behavior that you'd like to see put in place. Because if you hire a CEO who's going to change the culture you have just because they're so different, hopefully you want that change. Don't think that their skills will adapt to your culture. A new CEO and how they approach things will tend to change the culture of your organizations for good or for bad. Even if they don't want to, they will. Just by fact that people are going to look up and they're going to follow their lead, right? And I think that's sometimes something we don't think of, the unintentional change in culture that we put because we put someone in place without paying attention to how they get things done. So it's like that's why the screening and interviewing process, understanding how this person will operate is, I think, almost as important as the skills they bring.
Yeah, and that's a scary thing, an unintentional change in culture. That's one thing we really want to try and avoid. We want to try and be active managers of the culture. Scary to think about the culture getting away from us because it's one of our prized possessions. So I was going to ask you, Randy, if you had some advice or some war stories about cultural onboarding that have worked and cultural onboarding maybe that didn't work out so well?
Yes. I have. It goes back to mergers again because that was kind of our life, and so we acquired a company. We were a health plan, and we acquired a company in California that was a small company who were very hands on. They did not consider their customers insureds; they considered their customers patients, because not only did they reach out to insure Medicare eligible people, they made sure they stayed well. I mean, they sent people into the homes if they had diabetic insured clients to help them be on their meds. So that was a whole new way of operating. They didn't just offer Medicare insurance, they offered Medicare plus real live active health management. And they were petrified that when we took them over, we were going to destroy that. We were going to ruin that because that was inefficient. But in reality, we had to pay attention very much to why we bought that entity and how to protect that, and how not to let the larger company kind of creep in and say, no, we don't do it that way here, right? We had to intentionally say to the company that bought that smaller company, let that alone. We bought them because that part of them is making them unique and distinct, and we want to learn from them. So that was an example of where we didn't screw it up. An example of maybe where we did was we bought a company that just we weren't as attentive to how they made decisions, and they were more collaborative than we were, and we thought they were, as I said earlier, slow, and actually they were just being thorough, and so a frustration occurred, and things got off the track, and some people that we didn't want to have leave left, because some of the things they thought would still be true after the acquisition were no longer true. So, we didn't intend to have that effect, but by our negligence and just not paying close attention, it happened. So wins and losses, but the common theme in both is paying attention. Just paying attention and being very thoughtful about what is important to a culture, what makes it work, not just what's nice, but what makes it effective. And I think if you pay attention, you'll probably be fine.
That discussion that you just had about collaborative decision making and how one views it as thorough and another as slow reminds me of a difference in profiles in DISC or predictive index profiles, which we discussed in last week's episode. And it really is fascinating to me that an entire company can have a profile in a similar way. And that's really something that in our M&A processes, at least the one we did a couple of years ago, we didn't pay enough attention to as well.
Yeah, we learned that when with some professional help. We got some people to help diagnose what was working, what wasn't working about a combination of companies. And we found that was it. We just really didn't understand each other. And we were being judgmental rather than curious. And so I think there's a phrase I love called curiosity before judgment. And I think to the extent you can stay curious and learn about each other, it'll eliminate the likelihood that you become judgmental and do silly things.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of like high PIA leaders, like predictive index high A leaders. So we might be on the verge of being too similar. We'll have to work on that, but we're going through some training now, and we might be a little bit aggressive in that sense. So we'll have to think about that.
Yeah, because that's a really good point. Every once in a while, you intentionally want to bring someone in who is different.
Yeah.
Because you want their different style. You want to, so you got to be careful that when that's the case, you keep reminding the people that are already there, we're doing this by design. We want this person to help us be different, right? Otherwise, what will happen is the norms of the place just overwhelm that person. And even though you thought you hired them and they were different, then you don't embrace the difference that they bring. And you usually blame it on them. But the reality is it was you thought you wanted change and you hired for it, but you really didn't want it.
We did an exercise recently where like a case study, on people approaching a project differently, and one person was a little bit more reserved and the other person was more aggressive and upfront, almost everyone from our leadership group was like, well, that reserved person needs to get it together. Like, they just need to get it together and they need to step up. And our CEO was like, you guys, do you see what you are doing? So he kind of put us in check, which was good. But he's like, there are good people with all types of personalities. But yeah, so I agree, Randy, where diversity is key, and personality, and we need to work on that. But okay, so if you do all the right things on the hiring and as you're interviewing and bringing someone on, once the person actually gets there and they're being onboarded, is there anything we can do specifically to help that person transition into, whether it's our culture or just working for us? What's the best way to onboard someone?
I think shadowing with successful people, because there's words and then there's actions, and the most important thing is the actions. So letting people see what success looks like in your company, pairing them up with people who are good at something you want them to do well. Nothing more valuable than that. You can have all the training programs and slideshows in the world, and I think they're good to do those kind of things. There's certain disseminating things that have to be done. But the more you can pair them up with a guide, a buddy, a role model, that will really, really help a lot. And then it's that other thing I mentioned, just being patient, seeking to understand if there is a difference in style, having a conversation early on about it, not letting it drift, just to see if there is a disconnect, or maybe it's just the person is unclear on what's expected. A lot of times people fail in their job and don't start well because we're not being clear enough in what we really expect. So clarity of expectations without over managing somebody. Just here's the things we're looking for, and if you do these things, you'll be great. That helps. That's a big, breathe out for the new person. It's like, thank you for telling me. I appreciate that.
Good. Well, thank you so much, Randy. I always feel like I've learned a lot after we talk, and today was no different. So I appreciate your time. Before we go, is there anything you want to plug? Any kind of like last comments you want to leave our listeners with?
No, I think it's been great fun to be with you. I love how you both and your company pays such great attention to culture, and it's just it's wonderful to talk about this topic with you. I've enjoyed the opportunity yet again.
Thanks, Randy, for the time.
If I'm a Butler, I guess I'm allowed to say "Go Dogs," right? Go Dogs.
You are allowed to say "Go Dogs." I'll second that one. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Randy. It's always great to talk to Randy. He's got such a wide and varied set of experiences, and the ones that he shared about culture shock were really interesting and engaging, and I think we can learn a lot from those experiences. So what did we learn today?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways personally is I don't know if we do a great job of giving prospects a real feel for our culture. We have a couple of things in place, and we also try to be very transparent in an interview process. But just thinking about, I think it's hard for a candidate to almost trust what you're saying, and are you really being an honest person as the interviewer? So I think we're going to have to start thinking a little bit more about how to properly convey what it's really like to work here and what our cultural expectations are.
Yeah, I think as it relates to culture and job candidates, we sell our culture.
Yes.
So we're talking about all the wonderful things about our culture, that anybody's voice can be heard and you can have an imprint, and we invest and develop our people, and it's familial and all the things that are just wonderful about our culture, but we really don't dive into the other aspects that might create culture shock. We don't do much of that. I think we should.
Yeah, that's something we'll have to work on, and my gears are already turning on how to do that better. So I'll report back when we have a new system.
Yeah, and one of the key takeaways for me was this idea of putting together our cultural tenets. We have a mission, vision, we have value statements, and the cultural tenets will be similar to a value statement, but it will be a tool that we can use to walk through with our job candidates, so that they can say, this is how our culture shows up. And to the extent that it's different from what they're used to, that can already start the groundwork to adapt and maybe alleviate some of that cultural shock.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we talk a lot about empowering people and our flexible schedule and all these things people always tell us are the best parts, but we also were very direct, and we don't sugarcoat our communication with each other. And, we expect people to walk the floor no matter what position you're in. And that might not be what people want in a job. So I think that's what we need to work on is being completely transparent about all aspects of our culture.
Yeah, and as the example that Nathan shared, we have a flat hierarchy, so you don't manage or lead by position and authority, but by influence. That's a big difference from a lot of different companies. And yeah, Caroline, I got to agree. There's no sugarcoating here.
On our next episode, we will discuss the role and cost of ethics in culture.